Brian, thank you very much. This is really humbling in a lot of ways, I appreciate everybody being here tonight. It is sort of ironic, Brian sort of alluded to it. We started the Marine Science Research Institute, and some of you were involved in getting this award started. So it's sort of crazy to get an award that you helped start. But it is sort of fun. My topic tonight, focuses on the idea that I've been here 48 years. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And when I look back at it, and the irony of coming here, thinking I'd be here for 2 years as a visiting professor, and here I am 48 years later. I met my wife soon after I got to JU, and we have been married now 41 years. And we have 3 wonderful children, 2 of who are here tonight, along with my newest grandson. My big surprise tonight was my sister showed up, and I had gone through the VIP list and seen her name and said, "What, Aunt Lucy?" And she said, "Oh, no, I just put everybody's list." Susan, I just put everybody's name in the list. And then she walks in. So I appreciate my sister being here very much. And one of my big regrets, my father died at 71, and I'm older than my son, than he is, older now than he was. And my big regret is my children never got to know my father. So I appreciate you being here. One of the things, as I thought about all the things that have happened, the one constant we deal with is change. And so as we sort of work our way through this, I think I want to try to take this off of here. I talk better if I move around. I think I can do it this way, yeah. So this is the way we sort of started this whole thing, and I want to try to be fast because I'm a professor. I can talk for a long time and not say a whole lot, but we'll see what I got here in 1976, again, thinking I'd be here for 2 years. That was the same year that Hans Tandler skied and water skied in the St. Johns River. Prior to that, the city had been dumping 12 million gallons of untreated raw sewage into the river. We now dump about 35 million gallons, but have been treated. A whole different story. And not long after I got here, one of the faculty members said, "Hey, you got this background in marine biology. Why don't we should start a marine biology major." And I said, well, I don't want to call it marine biology because I believe marine science is more important, because to understand the ocean, you really need to know the chemistry and the physics and not only the biology, and put it all together. You need the computers, and we see things that happen, and it's been sort of fun watching this happen over the years. I gave a talk a few months ago to the Southeastern Estuarine Research Society, which is a group I've been with for 40 years, or for 50 years actually. And we got reflecting on what things have impacted marine science. And it was sort of interesting because one of the things we came up with, and I came up with at the time, was the impact of transistors. I mean, I was born in 1946. Transistors got here in 47, and it's impacting everything we do in marine science. And so when I think about where the changes began, that's where I sort of put it, is back on the transistor. And then computer ships comes along. I sort of add to it that Hurricane Dora hits Jacksonville in 1964. And so we're seeing these kind of things begin to happen. I put in the Alvin sub. The Alvin is a submersible that went down. Bob Ballard used it to find the Titanic, for instance. And one of the things that happened soon after they had the Alvin was they dropped the Alvin, bringing it back on the ship in 1968. And when that happened, it was sort of crazy because on that ship, on the Alvin, was some sandwiches, a thermos of soup, and an apple. And when they brought it up a year later, the sandwich, the soup, and the apple were still edible. And it began to open up the idea that the deep sea is a much different environment than the surface. We didn't know these things. And so these are the kind of changes we've seen in our lifetime, in my lifetime. My wife reminded me today that some of these things I was talking about, the children, the college students who were in my class today weren't alive then. So, this is all ancient history to them. Heck, things were happening in 2000 is ancient history to them. But we began working with computers in 1970. I had graduated from college in 68. I went to, as Brian mentioned, I was in the Army, did a year in Vietnam, and then came back, went to Virginia, And at that time, we were just beginning to use computers. When I got to South Carolina in '72, your cell phone today has more power than the mainframe that I used to get my PhD. And so it's sort of humbling as you sort of do that. We were using punch cards, and all my data was on punch cards. And it made a big difference in terms of how we process data. And today we get reams and reams of data instantly, and I'll talk more about that in a second. Also in the '70s, as I was ground truthing, I was doing something called ground truthing. NASA would fly over the Baruch Institute where I was doing my work, and we would be in the field collecting samples for water and getting temperature and salinity, chlorophyll and biomass and all kinds of parameters, while NASA flew these sensors over to try to sense what was happening on the ground. So we were trying to tell them, okay, this is what you're seeing, and they were correlating that with what they were seeing on their sensors. Well, that was the beginning of where we had satellites today, and the things that you can now call up in your phone. And when we look at hurricanes today, and all the data we get on all these things and sea surface temperatures, that was all pioneering through my career, which has been sort of fun to watch happen. Then in the early '70s, we started getting personal computers. Some people in this room may remember in '77 when Bob Ballard, who actually was the first Pioneer Award recipient, found the Titanic. Found hydrothermal vents. He later on found the Titanic. He would much rather be recognized for finding the hydrothermal vents than the Titanic, but he says, that's what people remember me for. In 1983, we started having cell phones. I thought I was a big deal when I had a cell phone in my car. It was a big, bulky thing, but I could talk to anybody, anywhere. It was really cool. We sort of went along because in the '90s, we began to see things like satellites doing imagery. And it became a much more exciting opportunity to observe things from afar. And this may be the challenge of our youth today, is the amount of information they're going to have looking forward. In 2008, we started the Marine Science Research Institute. And it's been a lot of fun sort of thinking about where we are and where it's going to go in the future. And then I talked about, we actually opened the building in 2010, and most of us remember Irma in 2017, doing $50 billion worth of damage, and it's probably going to get worse over the years. We opened the Marine Science Research Institute in 2010. That first picture that Brian showed of that middle picture was taken of me standing on top of what was then the unfinished first floor of MSRI. That was an incredibly emotional day for me, to climb a ladder and walk out on something I had dreamt about for many years, and it was actually being built. And I was standing on it, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. And I appreciate all the people who've supported this over the years. This is a picture Bruce Lipsky, photographer of the Times Union, took at Memorial Park during Irma. And we talked today, I wish I could say this was a once-in-a-lifetime thing. I don't think it is. I think it's going to happen again and again and again. And so we're going to see where it heads. The other thing is, I've been thinking a lot about how science has changed and how we used to do presentations. And when I first got here, we used to use transparencies, and I would use overheads. And I used things called rapidograph pens to draw my slides. And it took hours and hours and hours to do a graph and pictures and all this kind of stuff. And, you'd use it and okay, there it was. And then we graduated to using 2x2 slides. I mean, I've got 20,000 slides sitting in my den I got to do something with at some point in time. At least my wife says I got to do something with them. And we use carousel projectors. That's all gone away. It used to take us hours to develop film, and now people do it in seconds. You'll take pictures, thousands and thousands of pictures, because, we can. It's just amazing how we've done this. The other thing that's happened is when we used to do water quality analysis, one, it was very time-consuming. It took a long time. It was very expensive, and it was pretty complicated. We had big books called standard methods to refer to tell us how to do it. We used to do things like salinity. Now, we still do things like refractometers and we do hydrometers, but we also used to do titrations, and we use something called silver nitrate. Silver nitrate turns your fingers black. We were too cool to wear gloves, so we had to think, when you were doing silver nitrate, you had black fingers, so you looked sort of cool in the lab. But today we have these handheld instruments that we can get this information instantly. Used to be a lot of time and effort put into making sure the standards were accurate, and now you just calibrate it almost automatically. Same thing was true for dissolved oxygen. Used to do something called a Winkler method. And again, it was only as accurate as your standards. And yet today, again, handheld. We used to do very complex things with looking at chlorophyll. Used to take very, very expensive, complicated instruments. Again, we have a probe now on a handheld instrument. We're getting amazing amounts of data quickly, and that may be the biggest challenge that I see coming towards our scientists today, is the amount of information they're getting and how fast they're getting it. So what else has happened? Well, when I first got to Jacksonville, one of the things people told me was, the St. Johns River, it's one of 3 rivers in the world that flow north. Sorry, folks, there's a bunch of rivers that flow north. But it is 310 miles long, and what's totally unique about it is that it's wholly contained within the state of Florida. Most water bodies have multiple states on their borders, and so regulation and control become a big deal. So the fact we have a water management district that can look at the entire basin is really a positive thing for Florida. And we tend to look at the lower basin, which is part of Jacksonville, because again, it's north-south. The lower basin is north of the south basin, so we have to sort of think about that and how the river flows. But the river itself is very flat. It comes out of the mountains of Florida. See if you're paying attention. And all of 27 feet, and almost all of that fall is in the first 100 miles. The last 200 miles is flat. And so at times we can have low water flow, and the river can in fact flow south. It doesn't always flow north. We go back to thinking about what happened when Ponce de Leon first found Florida. And Florida means land of flowers. And I've often thought about what this area might have smelled like when he first got here, because it had to be incredibly sweet smelling with all the plants and all the flowers that were probably here. We didn't have trucks and diesels and planes and everything that polluted the air. So it must have been a much more beautiful place in that respect. First name for the St. Johns was the River May. Why? Because Ribault had found it in May 1st in 1562. And so you sort of begin to look at things like that. This is one of the early maps of the United States. And I'll sort of point out this, I don't think my little, that little bump down there is Florida. But the important thing is the cartographers had sort of one thing right, and that was that the coast actually runs sort of northeast, southwest. It runs like this. Jacksonville is a very western part of the Atlantic Ocean here, and if you go due north, you run into Columbus, Ohio. We're a Midwest city, we just didn't know it. We were first called Cowford because the cows could ford the river here. They swam, and they can do this. It's sort of fun watching them. But cattle were introduced by the Spaniards. The Florida Cracker, it was a name because the cattle drivers had whips that cracked. And so they would drive cattle and they would cross the river here because the river was broad, wide, and was flowing very slow. Average depth was probably 12 to 14 feet at the deepest point. This is one of the early maps of the St. Johns River, and I'll give you a second to look at it, and I challenge you to read it for 2 reasons. One, it's in French, and 2, it's upside down. Because apparently the cartographers didn't understand that the river flowed north. And so they drew the river the way they thought it flowed, which would be to the south, and so they had the orientation wrong. So it's just sort of one of those sort of quirky things as you sort of look at some of the old maps. Florida attracted a lot of people to come look at what was going on. The Bartrams. Fascinating book, The Travels of William Bartram. If you want to read really heavy Old English, it's a fun book to read. But it's also interesting to read because you can actually read it and figure out where he was at the time based on his descriptions. Audubon was here. Most people don't realize Audubon was a hunter, which is interesting. He got a gun there because he shot all his birds and stuffed them and then drew them. But he was in the area. That's the Fusilier San Marco in St. Augustine with a green-shanked bird. And so sort of a cool sort of thing. This is his picture of alligators. This is Bartram. So this is Bartram's alligators. And he talks about the alligators lining up to eat river shad, which they still do today. So it's sort of cool in that respect. The St. John's was a slow-moving river. People canoed on it. A lot of wood. We timbered heavily. The timber would float down the river, and the sawmills would then process the wood. And so you sort of began seeing these things begin to happen. A lot of fishing going on the river. This is one of the early maps, and I sort of point this out because all these sandbars were here because at the time there were two towns, Pilot Town and Mayport Mills, and this was where the bar pilots lived. And the bar pilots had to navigate these sandbars, and so the ships would pay them to come in and out of the harbor a fair amount of money to get them in and out, and so these two little towns emerged. First bridge across the St. John's was the FCC bridge, thanks to Henry Flagler. It wasn't an automobile bridge, but a railroad bridge. And it was a turnstile bridge that twisted. We eventually replaced it with the Basco Bridge, which goes up and down. This is a picture of the St. John's from 1918, and point out that along the upper reaches, it was all salt marsh. Well, we started dredging the St. John in the late 1800s. The jetties got put in the late 1800s. Here's Little Mayport, here's Pilot Town. And we began piling that material up along the shoreline here. A guy named August Heckscher built Heckscher Drive, which we know today. It was a toll road to allow people to get to Pilot Town. Eventually the state took it over. But it looks much different than it does today. In fact, I'll sort of point out back in the day, there was no Mayport turning basin. That was dug out in the late 1940s, actually post-World War II, to create the Navy base that we now know today. And Jacksonville has a long history of dredging the river, and we've sort of watched this happen over the years. And that may be the biggest thing we've seen changed. As I mentioned earlier, we had 12 to 14 feet, and now we have 30 or 47 feet. But this was the way they dredged, and I'll sort of point out they began dredging, spent not a whole lot of money by today's standards, but a lot by their standards then. And every 12 to 15 years, it seemed like we were going back to re-dredge and re-deepen the river. This is sort of a list of things that began to happen. One of the big things that happened was this used to be the St. John's that twisted around. This is Fulton Point, this is Dames Point, there's now a bridge across here. And this used to be called Brack River, and then we cut through it. When I first got to Jacksonville, there was a big crane sitting right here, and Offshore Power Systems was building nuclear power, or trying to build nuclear power stations with the Navy and some other folks. It never really worked. And so this is sort of what it looks like more today. We've also impacted the St. John's in other ways. Actually, it turns out beginning in the 1500s, the early explorers actually thought about the idea of building a canal across Florida. Now, they thought at the time you could just dig a canal and it would be fine because they didn't understand that the water levels were different on both sides of the peninsula. And so we began the project of the Cross Florida Barge Canal in 1964. Nixon stopped it in 72. It's still there. What are we going to do? Maybe one day we'll figure something out. We have this giant reservoir sitting back here. It's really just a pool now. There's a dam here, and all this wetlands got destroyed. Much of this wetland got destroyed. This is the Cross Florida Barge Canal going through here, straightened it all out. And about 15,000 acres were flooded of productive wetlands, basically. One of the impacts has been that the amount of water flowing into the St. John's from the Ocklawaha, which is the largest tributary to the St. John's, is down about 42% from original pre-construction days. So we're going to see where that one heads. We've also had a lot of interest over the years, and I don't think we always understand that what happens sometimes in foreign countries impacts what happens to us today. And I've had an interest in this Panama Canal for a long, long time. And it was interesting because my wife and I finally got to go there last spring. It was purely awe-inspiring to see what we had, I say we collectively, as a society created. Pure hydraulics, no engine, no pumps. The water flows based on the fact that it's unlimited rainfall, a huge amount of rainfall, I should say, not unlimited, huge amount of rainfall, and that rainfall allows them to just let the water flush down as it takes the boats with it. You sort of begin to realize how much cargo goes through that canal. My wife has joked that she'll never walk into Walmart again and not think about how much those container ships carry. Well, because the canal was only 40 feet deep, that was the deepest that the ships could be, was 40 feet. And due to some complex political, economic things, we began to realize we needed a deeper canal. And so we're beginning, it finally opened in 2017, I think. Years and billions of dollars over budget. We have created a bigger canal that has a 50-foot depth. Well, what that has caused is a driving force to deepen the St. Johns River even more. And so what's happened is we've now deepened the harbor to 47 feet. My prediction is we will probably continue deepening the river. One of the encouraging things about the St. Johns is it's an amazing resilient system. Despite all the things we do to it, it still comes about bounce back. But we've completed this project now to Dames Point and Blunt Island, and we're hoping that, we'll see what begins to happen. The other thing that's happened in my career, I watched, is the amount of growth that's happened in Northeast Florida and Florida in general. And it worries me a little bit because we're growing. This is a picture of what development sort of looks like today. And this is, the red is where we develop. The green is conservation lands. And the sort of other color is potentially developable land. If you project that ahead a little bit to 2060, that's what the development looks like. And we're seeing 1,000 people a day moving to the state of Florida. And I begin to wonder how sustainable that is in the long term. So we're going to see how that turns out. That's sort of the comparison of the two. The other thing I worry about is the amount of water we're pulling out. We're pulling out water from the aquifer, half of which we spray on our lawns to irrigate. And so you begin to worry about how much water we're going to have. We will never run out of water, but we may run out of cheap water. And if we had to go to desalinization, you're going to pay a lot more for water. And so that's going to be an impact to how many people continue to move to the state. One of the animals that I began to love early after I got here, when I first got to Jacksonville, I had mono. And all I did, it seemed like, was sleep, eat, and give lectures. And after a few weeks here, I went down to the waterfront here at JU and was sitting on what was then a sort of rickety old wooden dock. And suddenly underneath me, I get this, and this manatee had come up and exhaled. Scared the bejeebies out of me. But it began a relationship with manatees that continues to this day. And I've been very involved in manatee protection plans and things like that. And sort of began to realize, too, that if I did the kind of job I should do, I'd get both sides mad at me, which is sort of what happened. But then it sort of worked out over the time. We have seen the manatees recover. About 25 years ago, I did a video one time in which I predicted I thought the manatees would be extinct in our lifetime. A little scary because we were killing them faster than we were being born. Now, we've actually changed that in recent years. We have, up until 2019, we did something called synoptic sampling, which we participated in. Dr. Jerry Pinto's in the audience tonight. And we fly and count manatees along with other state agencies. What you find is that tells you the minimum number of manatees you know you have. And so we now think we have a recovering population, but some of the complex things that begin to happen is now begin to realize that the runoff we're having from our sewage is contributing to algae blooms, which is limiting the amount of food they've got. And you may remember a couple of years ago, we had a massive kill-off of manatees because they were starving to death. We've got to figure out a way we can balance these things. And so, Pogo once said, this was a poster from the first Earth Day, I have seen the enemy and he is us. And I think we need to make sure we understand that we can make a difference. And if there's a message I want out there, it's that what you do does make a difference. And so think about how you live your life and the little things you do, how much plastic you use, how much water you use, how much electricity you use. If you can use a little less, you'll make a less of a footprint. The other piece of this is I happen to think the future is extremely bright. I'm extremely excited. I talked to students today at lunch, and I hope the message to them was, when I look at the changes that have happened in my career over the last 48 years, 50, 60 years, however you want to count it, and where we've come and how we do things today, it's truly exciting where it's going to head. I had no concept of a cell phone when I was in college. Heck, I grew up with Dick Tracy and a wristwatch radio. I thought that was cool. And now everywhere, I shouldn't say everybody, people wear watches that do the same thing. So have fun, enjoy the ride. I think we'll have a lot of fun. So thank you all very much. Thank you very much.
So with that, I would like to award the 2024 Marine Science Pioneer Award to Dr. A. Quinton White.
Thank you. Thank you.
Congratulations, Quinton.
Thanks.
Good talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
It was fun.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Well deserved.
Well deserved. You've been a great support, as you have over the years. So thank you. Brian, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.